Act 1. The Sun in Splendor, the Gathering Storm. In the tumultuous 15th century, England was a kingdom forged in blood and betrayal. For decades, the noble houses of Lancaster and York had waged a brutal civil war for the throne. A conflict that would be forever known as the Wars of the Roses. It was an era of shifting allegiances, of sudden death, and of relentless ambition. Out of this chaos, a charismatic and formidable warrior king had emerged victorious. Edward IV of the House of York. His sigil was the sun in splendor. And for a time, it seemed that a golden age of peace and prosperity had finally dawned on the war-torn nation. King Edward IV was everything a medieval king was supposed to be. Tall, handsome, a brilliant military commander, and a man of immense charm. But he also had a fatal flaw. A love for women and a tendency to act on impulse. In 1464, he committed an act that would send shockwaves through the English nobility. He secretly married a commoner, a beautiful widow named Elizabeth Woodville. While it may have been a marriage of love, it was a political disaster. It alienated powerful allies who had been promised a royal marriage for their own daughters, and it brought the large, ambitious, and widely disliked Woodville family into the heart of the royal court. This single, romantic act sowed the seeds of a deep and bitter resentment that would fester for years, a resentment that would ultimately consume his own children. Despite the political turmoil, Edward and Elizabeth's marriage was a fruitful one. They had 10 children, including 2 healthy sons who would secure the Yorkist line of succession. Edward, born in 1470, and Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473. These 2 boys, the princes in the Tower, were the future of the kingdom. They were raised in luxury, educated to rule, their path to the throne seemingly assured. But there was another powerful figure at court, a man who had fought loyally beside King Edward through the bloodiest battles of the war. This was the king's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was the opposite of his handsome, charismatic brother. He was a serious, deeply religious, and intensely private man, a brilliant administrator and a loyal subject. But he was also a man living in the shadow of his brother's glory, a man who, some would later say, harbored a deep and secret ambition of his own. For as long as King Edward was alive and his sons were healthy, Richard remained a loyal servant of the crown. But the king, a man of great appetites, was not destined for a long life. In the spring of 1483, at the age of just 40, King Edward IV suddenly fell ill. After a short and mysterious illness, he died, leaving behind a kingdom in a state of precarious balance. His eldest son, now King Edward V, was only 12 years old. A child could not rule alone. A power vacuum was created, and into that vacuum, 2 powerful factions began to move. On one side were the Woodvilles, the family of the Queen Mother, Elizabeth. They were determined to maintain their influence and control the young king. On the other side were the old nobility, men who despised the upstart Woodvilles and saw their chance to regain power. And caught between them was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. King Edward, on his deathbed, had named his loyal brother Richard as Lord Protector of the realm, the man who would govern the kingdom until the young Edward V came of age. The news of the king's death sent Richard racing south from his base in the north of England. His stated goal was to protect his young nephew and ensure his safe coronation. But his actions suggested a different, more sinister motive. He intercepted the young king's party as they traveled to London, arresting the boy's Woodville guardians on charges of treason. He then took possession of the 12-year-old King Edward V himself. He entered London not just as a protector, but as a man in absolute control. The first pawn in a deadly Game of Thrones had been captured. Act 2. The Protector and the Prisoners. With the young King Edward V in his custody, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, now held the most powerful card in the deck. He rode into London in early May 1483, presenting himself not as a usurper, but as a humble and loyal servant of the crown, the devoted uncle and Lord Protector. He made a great show of his loyalty to his nephew, parading the young king through the streets and arranging for him to take up residence in the royal apartments at the Tower of London. At the time, this was not necessarily seen as a sinister move. The Tower of London was not just a prison. It was also a royal palace and a fortress, the traditional residence for a monarch awaiting their coronation. Meanwhile, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, upon hearing that her brother and son had been arrested by Richard, flew into a panic. Fearing for her own life and the lives of her remaining children, she sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. With her was her younger son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. She had essentially created a standoff. Richard, the Lord Protector, had one of the princes, the king, but the Queen Mother had the other, the heir, in reserve. For the next several weeks, a tense political chess game was played out. Richard, with the support of the old nobility who despised the Woodvilles, began to systematically consolidate his power. He had the Queen's relatives, who had been arrested, executed on trumped-up charges of treason. He postponed the young king's coronation, buying himself more time. His final, crucial move was to get his hands on the second prince. On June 16th, Richard surrounded Westminster Abbey with armed troops. He sent the Archbishop of Canterbury inside to persuade the Queen to release her younger son, arguing that the young king was lonely in the Tower and needed his brother's companionship. He gave his solemn oath that the boy would be safe. Elizabeth Woodville, trapped and powerless, was forced to relent. With tears in her eyes, she handed over her 9-year-old son. The young Richard, Duke of York, was taken to the Tower of London to join his brother. The trap was now set. The Lord Protector now had both of the princes securely under his control, locked away inside the impenetrable fortress. With both boys secured, Richard's propaganda machine went into overdrive. He began to circulate a shocking and scandalous story, a claim that would delegitimize his own nephews and pave his own path to the throne. He enlisted a friar named Ralph Shaw to deliver a public sermon, claiming that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The reason? Edward had allegedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman. If the marriage was invalid, then all of their children, including the 2 princes in the Tower, were illegitimate bastards, with no legal claim to the throne. The next in line, according to this new convenient truth, was none other than Richard, Duke of Gloucester himself. The 2 young princes, Edward and Richard, were last seen playing in the gardens of the Tower in the late summer of 1483. Then they vanished. The sightings stopped. They were never seen in public again. A profound and terrifying silence descended from within the walls of the Tower. The boys who held the key to the kingdom had disappeared from the face of the earth. Act 3. The Usurpation and the Silence. With both of his nephews safely locked away and the story of their illegitimacy spreading through London, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, made his final, decisive move. On June 26, 1483, Parliament, under heavy pressure from Richard and his allies, formally declared the 2 young princes to be illegitimate. They offered the crown to Richard. After a brief, theatrical show of reluctance, he accepted. On July 6, 1483, in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England. The usurpation was complete. The two young boys, who just a few months earlier had been the heirs to the kingdom, were now prisoners, their titles stripped, their futures uncertain. They were seen playing in the gardens of the Tower less and less frequently throughout the summer. Then, sometime in the late summer or early autumn of 1483, they vanished completely from sight. They were never seen alive again. A profound and terrifying silence descended from within the walls of the tower. The boys who held the key to the kingdom had disappeared from the face of the earth. Almost immediately, dark rumors began to circulate. People whispered that the new king, in a brutal act to secure his throne, had ordered the murder of his own nephews. The story of the missing princes became a powerful propaganda tool for Richard's enemies. A rebellion, led by the Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's former key allies, was launched in the autumn of 1483 with the stated goal of restoring the young Edward V to the throne. The rebellion was crushed, but it showed how vulnerable Richard's hold on power was, haunted as it was by the ghosts of his missing nephews. The most famous and enduring account of the prince's fate comes from Sir Thomas More, writing several decades later. According to More, who claimed to have gotten his information from men who were present at the time, King Richard III ordered one of his most loyal servants, Sir James Tyrrell, to go to the Tower and murder the two boys. More's account is chillingly detailed. He describes how Tyrrell's men smothered the two sleeping princes with their pillows and then buried their bodies at the foot of a staircase within the tower. For centuries, this has been the accepted story, the version of events immortalized by William Shakespeare in his famous play, Richard III, which painted the king as a monstrous, hunchbacked villain. King Richard III's reign would be short and turbulent. In 1485, just 2 years after taking the throne, he was challenged by a new claimant, Henry Tudor. At the decisive Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard was killed, the last English king to die in battle. Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII, establishing the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century. The new king, to solidify his claim, married the prince's eldest sister, Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. But the mystery of what had happened to her two younger brothers remained a dark, unspoken secret at the heart of the new Tudor court. Act 4. The Bones in the Tower. For nearly 200 years, the story of the princes remained a dark legend, a piece of Tudor propaganda solidified by Shakespeare's masterful pen. The world accepted that Richard III had murdered his nephews. But the story lacked one crucial element: physical proof. There were no bodies. The mystery was based on rumor and historical accounts, but not on forensic evidence. Then, in 1674, during renovation work at the Tower of London, a discovery was made that seemed to finally confirm the darkest rumors. Workmen, while demolishing a staircase near the White Tower, the very staircase mentioned in Sir Thomas More's account, unearthed a wooden chest. Inside the chest were the skeletons of two young children. The bones were of a similar age to the two lost princes. The discovery was a sensation. The reigning king, Charles II, convinced that these were the remains of the long-lost princes, ordered the bones to be given a royal burial. They were interred in an urn at Westminster Abbey, where they remain to this day. For many, this was the final tragic proof. The The bones in the tower seem to be a perfect match for the story of the murder. However, modern science has cast a shadow of doubt over this seemingly simple conclusion. The bones were briefly exhumed and examined by scientists in 1933. While the examination confirmed they were the remains of two children of approximately the right age, the methods of the time were not advanced enough to determine their sex, the exact date of their death, or a cause of death. Crucially, no DNA testing was performed. Today, historians are divided. Are the bones in the Westminster Abbey urn truly the remains of Edward and Richard, or do they belong to some other unfortunate children, buried long before or after the prince's disappearance? The royal family has, so far, refused all requests for a modern DNA analysis of the bones, a decision that has only deepened the mystery. This lack of definitive forensic proof has allowed for the rise of a number of alternative theories. A revisionist view of history that seeks to exonerate King Richard III. This movement, often championed by the Richard III Society, argues that the story of Richard as a monstrous, child-killing villain is a complete fabrication, a piece of brilliant Tudor propaganda designed by Henry VII to legitimize his own shaky claim to the throne. They argue that it made no political sense for Richard to kill the princes. He had already had them declared illegitimate, legally removing them from the line of succession. Their continued existence, locked away in the tower, was proof of his claim. Their murder, on the other hand, only created a storm of rumor and rebellion that weakened his reign. So if Richard didn't kill them, who did? The revisionists point to another powerful and compelling suspect, Henry Tudor himself. According to this theory, the princes were still alive when Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field. When Henry VII took the throne, the two boys, who many still saw as the rightful heirs, were a massive threat to him. He, therefore, had them secretly murdered to eliminate any rivals to his new dynasty. This theory neatly explains the lack of contemporary outrage. Henry Tudor, the new king, controlled the narrative. It was a dark secret at the foundation of the glorious Tudor era. Another suspect in this version of events is the Duke of Buckingham, the man who led the first rebellion against Richard. Perhaps he had the princes killed and then blamed Richard, hoping to seize the throne for himself. Act 5. The Pretenders. Even with the rise of the Tudor dynasty, the ghosts of the lost princes refused to fade away. Their story remained a potent political weapon, a symbol of the unresolved trauma of the Wars of the Roses. The fact that no one had ever seen their bodies meant that there was always a sliver of a possibility that one or both of them might still be alive, waiting in the wings to reclaim their throne. This uncertainty created a fertile ground for one of the strangest chapters in English history, the era of the Pretenders. In 1487, a young boy named Lambert Simnel was put forward by a group of disgruntled Yorkist supporters. They claimed that he was not, in fact, a common boy, but Edward, Earl of Warwick, another young Yorkist prince who had been imprisoned by Henry VII. But the rebellion, seeking to gain more support, soon began to claim that Simnel was, in fact, one of the lost princes from the Tower. The rebellion was ultimately crushed by Henry VII forces at the Battle of Stoke Field. Simnel was captured, but in a strange act of mercy, the king, recognizing he was just a pawn in a larger game, pardoned him and gave him a job in the royal kitchens. The first pretender had been dealt with, but a far more serious threat emerged a few years later. In 1490, a charismatic and handsome young man appeared in Burgundy, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two lost princes. This young man, who came to be known as Perkin Warbeck, was incredibly convincing. He looked the part, he spoke eloquently, and he seemed to know intimate details about the English royal court. He was accepted as the real prince by many of the royal houses of Europe, who were eager to see the downfall of the Tudor king. For nearly 7 years, Perkin Warbeck was a major thorn in the side of King Henry VII. He was a ghost king, a powerful symbol for all those who opposed the Tudor regime. He launched several attempted invasions of England, all of which ultimately failed. He was finally captured in 1497, after a public confession, in which he admitted to being a commoner from Flanders. He was imprisoned and later executed. The stories of the pretenders, particularly Perkin Warbeck, have only deepened the mystery of the princes in the Tower. Were they just clever imposters? Or is it possible that one of them, especially Warbeck, was the real deal? The fact that Warbeck was able to convince so many powerful people for so long is, for some, a sign that he may have been the genuine Richard, Duke of York. Perhaps one of the princes had been smuggled out of the Tower and raised in secret on the continent. It's a romantic and tantalizing possibility, though one that is not supported by mainstream historical consensus. The stories of the pretenders are a final, strange, and ultimately tragic chapter in the saga of the Lost Princes. Act 6, The Enduring Enigma. More than 500 years have passed since the two young princes were last seen playing in the gardens of the Tower of London. The world has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in the 15th century. Dynasties have risen and fallen. Empires have crumbled to dust. Yet, the mystery of what happened to Edward and Richard remains one of the most compelling and fiercely debated cold cases in history. The story endures because it is a perfect storm of history, mystery, and human drama. It is a story of ambition, betrayal, and the tragic fate of two innocent children caught in a brutal game of thrones. Was Richard III a monstrous, child-killing villain, a caricature of evil as painted by Shakespeare? Or was he a loyal, tragic figure, a victim of a brilliant and ruthless smear campaign orchestrated by his Tudor successors? The truth, it seems, is buried too deep under the layers of propaganda and time to ever be fully known. Today, the debate rages on. Modern science holds a potential key. A full DNA analysis of the bones in the Westminster Abbey urn, compared with the DNA of a known descendant, could finally prove whether or not they are the remains of the lost princes. If they are, it would lend powerful support to the traditional story of their murder within the Tower. If they are not, it would open the door to the tantalizing possibility that one or both of them survived. But the decision to conduct such a test rests with the current monarch of England, and so far, the royal family has been reluctant to disturb the ancient royal graves. And so, the mystery continues. The two boys remain frozen in time, forever young, forever lost. Their story is a chilling reminder of the brutal nature of power, and of how easily the innocent can be swept away in the great, bloody tides of history. They are the ghosts that haunt the Tower of London, the lost kings of England. Their final fate a secret that the stones of the tower will likely keep forever.